Okay, good evening, everyone. Given the fact that we are recording the class, I don't see any reason why we should prolong, but let's rather start. And the recording will be made available to the students. So today we are covering chapter 3, which is really a continuation of the first chapter the last chapter that we covered, which was chapter 2. And the focus now in chapter 3 is really to put to expression those labor legislation that we spoke about, particularly what we called the substantive acts, which is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Employment Equity Act, the Labor Relations Act, and also those three substantive acts: the LRA, the BCA, the EEA. What we then now look at is the system of labor within the South African context. And what we can learn from all of this, if you like to put simply, is that it is a very volatile, it is a very difficult terrain to sometimes navigate through because of the challenges and the histories that are tied with this labor relations system. And its uniqueness within the South African context is that the struggle of the country is uniquely woven into the battle for labor, and not necessarily the battle for labor, but also the collectiveness that exists amongst the varying body of players that are all manifesting within this context. And so the issues at stake here are not just at a labor perspective, but the issues at stake are more also at a very large perspective tied to the historical nature of the country, which is a more macro perspective of understanding things. To confirm, I hope the slides are moving and everybody can see. So this is chapter 3, which is the South African labor relations system. The first thing we must understand about this labor relations system is this idea of the ways in which we arrive to an understanding of the relationship between the components of the labor system. This is what we call the approaches to labor relationship. And the approaches to labor relationship offers an understanding in different countries and different contexts as to the relationships and the power dynamics that exist between the different actors in the labor relationship movement. The first of these approaches is known as the unitary approach. So the word uni means one. So this is one way of seeing things, or which is one-sided, if you like, and it's really rooted in the classical liberalism approach, where at the center stage of all of this, the individual is given some form of recognition uh, as an important part of the dynamic of labor, not necessarily as part of a collective. So employees and employers are assumed to have the same view with regards to the nature of businesses and enterprise, or the nature of which labor should exist. Employers themselves or their managers are there to manage, and employees are there to work. So it's this unitary, one-sided way of viewing things. Not to be outdone, also other issues at stake. The other issues concern the viewpoint of goals. Goals in this case are seen to be sided according to the basic needs that each party is pushing for. So the employee, therefore, is being rewarded for the efforts they've put in and the work that they've done. On the other hand, the employer is there to maximize on the profit and to benefit from all the people that are working from them. So conflict often arises because if a person does not understand the needs of actors within this unitary approach, it's more or less that some conflict arises, which often results in parties often either expressing this conflict, and in some cases, the expression of the conflict is done in a way that is very counterproductive and bad in the sense that it would violate certain ideals and principles around collective bargaining because they don't recognize bargaining to happen at an individual level. And so the unitary approach and its understanding informs then the birth of what we now understand to be the work of trade unions, what we now understand to be the important work that is done in ensuring that actors and important parties are pushing for the ideals of collectivism, which is this birth of unionism, which is this birth of trying to say there must be more than one way of seeing things. We must be able to see things from a different perspective that allows us also to be able to allow for a dissenting voice. This then leads to another approach away from the unitary approach to what is known as the radical approach, rooted in the work of Karl Marx or Marxism. It hinges on the ills and the challenges that often exist with private ownership of wealth, particularly the means of production, and also the position of the worker within this capitalist system. The view really is that due to the exploitative nature of the capitalist system, the employee is always being exploited, and there is necessity for voice to be given, particularly to the concerns of the employees, and not just voice, but also agency, which is this idea that there must be this ability to make decisions that is allowed on the basis of an employee who is in a system that is often exploitative. So conflict is therefore inevitable because of this viewpoint of seeing things on two polarized ends. And the preferred approach really is by unionists is really the one where there's this clear demarcation between the two parties at stake. The other viewpoint is known as pluralism, which is, I guess, the word plural, which means more than one. And really, this is one of the means of accommodating diversity, particularly considering the differing opinions that may exist. Power, therefore, is widely distributed. Everybody has got some form of agency. Everybody has got some form of voice. There are multiple centers of power, and this gives birth really to the idea of bargaining and the idea that we can compete for different centers of power. Unlike the radical approach in pluralism, we are actually allowing for people to seek to do away with the capitalist system, not to do away with it rather in totality, but to seek ways of reforming it. And this idea here is this idea that if things change, if organizations change, so what should also be changing are the ways in which we view dynamics such as the ones that employees are subjected to. So compromise is always reached, and it's one of those consensus-seeking techniques, and it's the one which is adopted in most industrialized societies, allowing, if you like, maybe for a bit of progression in terms of how people not only view labor, but also how people view the viewpoint of diversity of opinion and how that is accepted. A most commonly accepted viewpoint is the one of the social corporatist perspective, because the social corporatist perspective is one which allows us to be able to see things also from the opinion of the other. There is emphasis on cooperation and agreement amongst parties. There is opinion that if there is dissension, dissension should be heard. There's opinion that conflict will always be inherent in the employment relationship and should never be seen as anything that's bad, but something that is there to edify the nature of the employment relationship. So in such a system as we have adopted, particularly in the South African context, people can strike because people are allowed, as in the laws that we looked at yesterday, to have that expression of striking. People can withdraw their labor because they are allowed to be able to do that as part of the expression of the employment relationship that we looked at. And so what happens in this ideal state really is then unions are seen as an important negotiating power in improving the dynamic of labor. And this is mostly what we have adopted in South Africa. I mean, you have seen times when COSATU calls for a massive shutdown, and all the affiliate unions to COSATU join in this shutdown as a way of support and as a way of enhancing the labor relations system. And so this gives cadence to the importance of trade unions and employer organizations. A trade union is a body that is representing the interests of employees. An employer organization is a body that is representing the interests of employers. In this case, a union is therefore permanent. It sticks and it's established by workers, representing the interests of workers. Its aims are to protect worker ideals, to promote collective bargaining, and ultimately it's a needs-based type of organization whose aim is to improve the living conditions of workers and make sure that workers are not exploited, but workers are heard and given voice as part of the system that they work in. We also ultimately then know of unions as an important part of making sure that collective bargaining happens. And collective bargaining, if you like, think of it as a central command area where negotiations, discussions around difficult things that concern the workplace are given priority and are given importance, particularly in shaping the nature of that employment relationship. So collective bargaining really is there to instill that the standard of living and the working conditions are upheld through a centralized mechanism where people can come and vent out whatever grievances that they have. We've got a range of unions that are in existence, and some of you may belong to some of these or may know more which are not appearing here. We've got SATU, which is the South African Democratic Teachers Union. We've got NAPTOSA, the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa. We've got NEHAWU. I work within an education setting where we've got the work of NEHAWU, NTEU, playing a huge part. And we've got DINOSA, which is more in the nursing fraternity, which is the Democratic Nurses Organization of South Africa. We've got other examples of union: POP-CRU, which is the Police and Prison Civil Rights Union; SAPU, which is the South African Police Union; PSA, which is the Public Service. We've got all of these unions that are in existence in different sectors, which is representing the collective will of people coming together to be able to bargain and improve the conditions of workers. There are two issues we must talk about. The first one is the issue of security. If you like, security here in this case means money, capital. How do unions make their money? And what are some of the mechanisms that are used by unions to be able to achieve some form of rent in terms of what they are doing? There are two ways that this is done. I think one of them is the closed shop agreement, which is the way of saying that the union, the employer then negotiates with only one union, and that one union becomes the dominant union, and everybody then joins that dominant union, and that's all part of the closed shop agreement. We also have what we call the agency shop agreement, where we can say, okay, we can allow the existence of other union bodies within the workplace, but what we're going to do is allow also for those who may not necessarily be members of the union to pay what's known as an agency fee, which is really to say, we realize when a union goes and negotiates, even some of us who are not members of the union are going to benefit as part of this negotiation. So to support the work of the union, we will pay what we call an agency fee towards the work of the union, even though we may not be members of the union. So all of this allows then money to happen, to circulate within the union to promote its activities. It allows for improved economic conditions, working conditions, some form of fairness and justice, and also some form of social action and impetus to the work that unions do. The three players to all of this, therefore, become the state, the employee represented by a union, and also the employer represented by what we call an employer organization. This is an important triad in making sure that ideals around the labor relations system are not only promoted, but these ideals are also upheld as part of the idea of working together to achieve collective bargaining. So we can ask two questions. The first of these questions is, why would somebody join a union? And the second question is, why would somebody not join a union? Well, the reason to join a union for some people can also be rooted around philosophical ideals and ideas of um, wanting to have a voice that represents the interests of those who may be perceived to be marginalized. So we can have ideas such as I join a union because the union is there to represent me and ensure that my job is secure. I join a union because the union is there to represent me in terms of the wages and benefits, improving my working conditions, and some fairness and justice towards the ideals, these two ideals, particularly in a workplace, which can often be interpreted to be very repressive. I join a union because it's an important mechanism that allows me to be heard. I join a union because I also need to belong, what we call social relatedness. I also can refuse to join a union because a union will want me to pay something, a fee every month. So why should I be paying a fee every month? I would not join a union because of the union is perceived to be ineffective. The other workers don't support the union. Unions are perceived to be occupying a dysfunctional role, such as intimidation. Unions also are perceived by some people to failing to meet the needs of the constituents that they belong to. So I then make a fundamental decision that based on this, I prefer not to join the union. We can even add further and say, what does one need? What does a union need to be formally recognized within the confines of the workplace? Well, there must be some form of independence. There must, in other words, independence from the employer. So an employer cannot form a union and say, this is the union, because it will subsequently mean that the employer has control over what that union does. The union must have an address within the Republic of South Africa. The union must have a name, must have a constitution, and these are things that you can even go online and they are readily available. The union must keep books. The union must have financially audited statements that it can always refer to, and these audited statements must be made available to employees, because if they belong to this organization, they want some form of proof or evidence that there is all of these things that are happening. The union is also there to provide a fully compliant list of members that belong to the union. This may include members that are who are making deductions based on their contributions. But also, a union must also keep its minutes of its arrangements so that it doesn't appear that everything is done in a clandestine manner under the cover of darkness without involving all necessary stakeholders. We can take it further by saying that unions, therefore, seek to promote rights, which are these rights that they have access to the workplace, and these are things that employers must recognize and must respect as part of the relationship of employment. These things include access to the workplace. So the employer cannot say to a union, you do not have access to this workplace. This includes things like the meetings that happen at the workplace. This includes a stop order facility that allows for deductions to be taken off an employee who's a member of the union. And for those who are in leadership at the union, they are allowed to take leave to be able to promote trade union activities. The majority representative trade unions of unions must have some form of an election of a stop steward, who's another term there is a trade union representative, and there must be some form of disclosure of information around what is going on and what is the role of these people. So the stop steward, or otherwise known as the word trade union representative, is an ordinary employee given the task, given the responsibility of making sure that they are assisting the work of the union to be able to be happening, making sure that they are assisting the work of the union to flourish, and that there are no impediments to the nature of um, this working relationship. So an ordinary employee chosen by the masses or the fellow workers to represent them in how they deal with management. The tasks of a shop steward are twofold, which is really a functional task and also an administrative task. The functional task means that they are enrolling members, making sure that members are joining the union, making sure they also answer any questions from these members, making sure they also do what is also an administrative responsibility, that they are discussing any complaints with management, they are looking after the well-being of this management and all these union members. So the number of shop stewards, therefore, in the workplace can be 2, 3. It really depends. But what we want really is for these shop stewards to be able to allow for expression and allow for room to be able to do the work that they're supposed to do. They are allowed to take time off work during working hours so that they attend to union activities, and the disclosure of information around those things, around minutes, which we spoke about here, bookkeeping, financial statements. So they occupy two roles. The first role is more functional in terms of member relationships, and the second role is more administrative, keeping the paperwork around the activities that are happening. Shop steward also have the responsibility amongst those two activities to also go and speak on behalf of employees to management, negotiate wages, hear their grievances, and pass these grievances to the employers who then respond. They also have a right to attend training courses or conferences even during the time of work, so that they are able to be able to work and do their duties more effectively. So really, they also represent the idea of representing employees at events and stages such as the CCMA, where conflict may arise. So a shop steward therefore would differ from a trade union official in that those union officials are not normally elected from amongst the workers, but a trade union representative or a shop steward is elected from the workers. They are normally appointed and employed and paid by the trade union. On the other hand, shop stewards are elected by the union members and are not paid by the union for acting as a shop steward. The shop stewards would then therefore try to have a greater deal of autonomy away from the other parties. The second aspect is we look at trade unions. We also look at employers organizations. Employer organizations exist as these bodies. So a union represents the interest of members. An employer organization represents the collective representation of workers, of bodies that speak on behalf of the employer. So in fairness, these are people that are tasked with the responsibility of making sure they are representing the interests of the employer. And these are coming about as a result of Labor Relations Act 66, which really has the same rules. What are those rules? These rules around the formation of a trade union for employees. The same rules apply for those organizations, otherwise known as employer organizations, representing the interests of employers. They can be thought of as the unions of employers. Employer organizations, according to Finnemore Mathian, Professor Mathian Finnemore, they are formal, voluntary. They are there to advise, defend, or represent and lobby the interests of their organizations. Equally, the union also exists, also doing the same activities for the employees. So employer organizations also answer to the name of employer associations, employer federations, and they exist really with the same mandate as the trade unions. They take various forms and industries. They are also mandated to register with the Department of Labor, but advised to do so in addition to those other rules that we spoke about. Their rights are regulated by the Labor Relations Act. They do not act out of mandate or repression or a law unto themselves. They represent also the interests of their constituent bodies. Examples of these within the Eastern Cape, we've got the Border Industrial Employers Association. We've got the Employers Organization for Retailers and Allied Trades. We've got the Commuter Bus Employers Organization, the Employers Association of Afro Hairdressing and Cosmetology, the National Recyclers Organizations. All of these are representative bodies of employers who form organizations of their own. And like I say to you, their requirement must be similar to that requirement that has been enshrined with the aims of the trade unions: have an address, have a constitution, the mandate of keeping minutes, an audit trail of their activities, and that they are just not a law unto themselves. So these are some of the requirements: the audit of books, bookkeeping, list of members, financial statements, and any minutes or ballots that may have been done. Ultimately, trade unions exist to assist us with collective bargaining. In this case, collective bargaining would refer to the idea that we must come together and have a unified voice around what is happening in certain industries. A couple of years ago, I took this slide, this news clip from the South African Government News Agency, and it was talking about the then Minister of Labour, Mildred Oliphant, about the challenges that are affecting labour, particularly amongst those that are working, especially in sectors. In Newcastle, they looked at clothing and textile associations. And what this clip, this news feed really emphasizes is the importance of making sure that we understand the ideals of collective bargaining. That collective bargaining comes about as a result of not just what we have in the current sense, but the history that leads us to have certain systems and structures that we have. So we are in a very fragmented world where there are challenges around the minimum wage. We are starting to talk also about the youth wage subsidy. There's also talk about a declaration around what executives earn and take home as a way of knowing really our current situation as a basis of trying to position how we can become better. We've got low levels of wages. We've got a poverty line, that a huge divide between those that have and those that don't have. We've got minimum wages, which then complicate the relationship to collective bargaining. And we also have challenges even around the interpretation of how this is done. Some will start talking about the RET movement, which is this radical economic transformation, which is this idea that we should be, some people argue we should be pursuing to seek to try and change the challenges that characterize the South African situation. So collective bargaining therefore exists as one of the major functions that is coming from a post-apartheid, in a post-apartheid world that is enshrined within the Labor Relations Act and allowing a platform where negotiations can take place, bargaining councils are in existence to improve the dilemmas that we have. It is a process where employers and employees come together to seek a way of reconciling conflicting ideas around the table, and the dynamic of demand and concession is therefore a common one, and the objective ultimately is for agreement. I mean, I spoke to you yesterday or 2 days ago that never come to the table with a fixed position. The idea is that if you're coming to the table and saying you want a 5% increment, be prepared that the other party is going to try and negotiate as low as possible. So it could be, okay, 5%, let's agree for 3.5 or 4%. It would be absurd that one party is coming with 10% increment and the other one is saying, no, we can only offer 1%. That the difference of opinions around the range of polarization that exists between the two parties is actuated by sometimes the necessity for people to realize that this is a negotiation. People come to the table not with fixed positions, but being able to say, look, I'm open to interpretation and see how we can work together. The International Labour Organization therefore views collective bargaining to be an important worker-employee process of negotiation, which leads to the signing of what we call a CA, or a collective agreement, which leads to different stakeholders coming to the table to be reconciled, which leads to negotiations, and which leads to the necessity of hearing each other out for the sake of promoting and making sure that the labor relationship does not collapse. So the objectives of collective bargaining exist in this idea that we must promote democracy. We must also have some form of procedure, substantively and procedurally, about how this happens. And we must have mutual interests being respected for the sake of not only respecting liberties that everybody has, but also making sure that ideals of capitalism, which is profit making, are promoted and happen as they should happen. So the main function really is collective agreement, making sure that we come to an understanding that we may have different opinions, but our opinions help to shape us and make us see things from a different point of view. What makes it collective? Well, remember the societal cooperativist perspective, the coming together of different stakeholders can also be then attesting to what makes collective bargaining collective. We've got different levels through which collective bargaining happens, as you can see on the screen. This includes at a multinational level, intercountry. This includes at a national level, at a different sector level, at a plant level. And we're not going to be very prescriptive here to say this one is the best or this one is not the best. I think depending on the situation in that particular context, each of those can be recognized in an important way of bargaining. We also have the position in South Africa where we are gifted to have instruments such as NEDLAC, which allow us to also have this collective bargaining. It can happen at a sector or a centralized bargaining level. It can even happen at a workplace forum. It allows for expression that people can be able to do it. NEDLAC, which is the first of those, is the National Economic Development and Labor Council. It is really a forum that brings together various stakeholders from the state, business, labor, and the community, whose mandate is to come together to speak to the things that we are talking about here, the things that are around promoting collective bargaining. We reach consensus and agreements on matters related to labor, and these are then forwarded to Parliament. Parliament considers these, and Parliament turns these into legislation or instruments of or edicts that are able to support what happens on the labor front at a national level. We also have bargaining that can happen at a particular sector. I think the example I gave there was for in the clothing and textile sector. So different sectors have different negotiations. It happens a lot also within the farming sector, where you can have those who work in the wine industry can come together as people in that sector to come and negotiate. So what comes out of these forums is a collective agreement, and really this is a written agreement around matters that would have been points of dispute, like the wages, the conditions of work that characterize the particular industry. These bargaining council agreements are then permanent structures that debate these matters, made out of representatives of labor. The Labor Relations Act then sets out their conditions and their setting up of these councils, and the parties then negotiate for the best possible outcome, which can then be even reported in a government gazette. And when this is done, all the problems around the conditions of work are then referred to a council for investigation, and this is also enshrined within the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. And this council has powers of inspection to make sure that there is compliance to whatever agreement that has been made. And this then can then put the two things that we spoke about earlier on, the idea of the closed shop agreement, which is really this idea that the employer can then close and negotiate with one union, or the idea of the agency shop agreement, which is this idea that we can deduct an agency fee. At least we know once a union negotiates and a collective agreement comes out of the process, that collective agreement covers everyone, including those who may not necessarily have been supporting of the challenges that are happening. So we can ask some reflective questions. I think these questions are just meant to help you as you read chapter 3. For instance, what is a trade union? And also know the opposite of a trade union, which is the employer organization. Why do we have a trade union? Or why do people join a trade union? Or why do people not join a trade union? Give 2 examples of trade unions that you are aware of that operate within a South African context. Provide a differentiation between the agency shop agreement and the closed shop agreement. Outline the different players and their interests in the triad of employment. Why would people join a trade union, or why would people not join a trade union? What are the 4 requirements that are needed when registering a trade union in South Africa? What are some of the requirements required when registering an employer organization in South Africa? What are the 5 obligations that are required for union operation in South Africa? And what is a shop steward, and outline the duties of a shop steward? Those are the range of questions that we can come to expect as we focus on this particular chapter. And like I say to you, this chapter is linked to the previous chapter, which was the chapter on the South African labor system, the labor laws system. This one, we're now particularly looking to the ideas of the labor relations system. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. I will allow for that, and then we can end today's class. Anyone with any questions they would like to ask or comment? Okay, yes. Is it, I think, Nolufefe?
Thanks, Sam. I just want to ask about the assignment. You said today you're gonna give us the
Yes, we're coming to that.
guidance.
Yeah, we're coming to that. I just want to finish the formal
chapter
part of the yeah. If there are no questions there, I want to okay, Mandisa.
Oh, no question, docs. I just want to report there are 3 colleagues who are having a network challenge. Ngola, Nganda. I forgot the 3rd one.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, but like I said, the recording is available on YouTube, and it will also be available on Blackboard. Can I just get an indication as well from this class? Are you guys on Blackboard?
Yes, doc.
Yeah, so you should be able to you should also be able to see the content on Blackboard. I've put the slides, chapter 3 slides. I've also sent them to your email, and I'm going to also put the video for this recording. Okay. Okay, so I want to stop the recording so that we can talk about the other part and then answer, I think it's Nolufefe's question.